Donc, bonjour, bienvenue à cette première conférence et merci d'y être. Première d'une longue série, on l'espère, sur l'Arctique. Mon nom est Mathieu Landriot, j'enseigne ici à l'Université d'Ottawa, aussi directeur de l'Observatoire sur la sécurité et la politique en Arctique, OPSA. So thank you for coming here for the first of, we hope, many conferences on the Arctic here at the University of Ottawa and at CIPS. Today, very excited to hear from individuals from different backgrounds, so civil society initiatives, as well as research and government, on one theme, which is gender in the Arctic region. For Arctic scholars, I think we're always surprised to when we look at Arctic governance, it seems like an emerging form of governance, inclusive, that tackles many different issues. Always surprised to see that some issues are maybe not as tackled or not addressed directly as others, especially to see that gender issue has not been tackled as much as maybe other ones in Arctic governance. So really thrilled to see those issue addressed in the past few years and now, and I think in the future, from our panelists will share with us. So we have Tanny Pryor, which is a co-founder of Women of the Arctic Initiative, also a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo. Magali Marino, which is a researcher at Institut National de Recherche Scientifique, did a lot of research on also northern women and especially Inuit women and challenges they're facing. And Yuta Wark, which is director of at Global Affairs Canada of the Polar Affairs Division. Maybe we should start with Yuta for the purpose of this conference. So.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us and thank you for the opportunity to come to the university to talk about this important subject matter. On my way here, I was thinking that we were probably going to have a very small crowd because the university schedule must be very intensive at the moment in terms of writing papers and exams. So I'm very, very pleased to see this great turnout. I'll do a quick presentation, a quick run through. There we go. I'll start out by saying who we are. So as mentioned, I represent the Polar and Nordic Relations Division at Global Affairs. And we work with a number of colleagues within our department to manage Canada's international engagement on Arctic issues. So in that regard, we work with our oceans law section, but also with our safety and security colleagues within the department. In terms of my own division, we have a number of priority mandate areas that we work in, specifically to Canada's foreign policy on Arctic issues, but we're also managing investment and trade commercial relationships in the Arctic, but also more bilaterally with our Nordic partners. And we actually have a colleague from Finland who joined us for this presentation today. So thank you for that. We're very keenly interested in promoting Arctic science and research, and that, as you will hear more of later, includes an emphasis on Indigenous science and knowledge. And we focus much of our attention and resources on advocating on Northern issues on behalf of Northerners, including Indigenous Northerners, very importantly, internationally. In other words, we use foreign policy tools and levers that we have at our disposal as a Foreign Affairs Department to advance Northern issues. We also work with other departments a fair amount, but given the time that we have here, maybe I'll leave that for now. So what's exciting in our life at the moment? The Prime Minister decided at the end of 2016 that it was time to refresh our Arctic policies and strategies. In the past, we had a Northern strategy that came out in 2009 that guided investments and work within Canada, and that was followed by a foreign policy statement in 2010 that was specific to the international work that we do. This time around, though, the approach is different and is very interesting in two respects. One is that we're developing this new Arctic, we call it, the working title is the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. We're doing it in an integrated fashion in terms of looking at the domestic elements and the international elements in an integrated fashion. From my point of view, and I think my colleagues certainly at the department would support that, that gives us an opportunity to hone in on very specific and high priority issues and challenges that we see in our northern region, and we use international approaches to meet those challenges moving forward. And the second very unique feature of this policy is that the Prime Minister made a commitment to co-developing it. And that is really an effort for the federal government to work very closely with subnational jurisdictions, in this case, the 3 territorial governments, Quebec, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Manitoba, because they have northern regions, to work together with them, and also very importantly, in the context of our reconciliation agenda, to work with Indigenous interlocutors, communities, and organizations to come together in terms of creating this new policy and to sort of prioritize Canadian interests, both domestically but also internationally. Now, this has been a long time coming, because those kinds of commitments to co-development mean that you need time to do this properly. We've been at it for over 2 years. We are hoping that the policy framework will be coming out, will be announced by the government prior to the election. So keep your eyes open for that. In terms of priority areas that have emerged as a result of the consultations and the engagements that was undertaken, you can see on the slide. I won't go over them, but just very importantly to say that Northerners are very, very interested in infrastructure investment and economic development. Those are definitely the top tier interests, because the communities are facing challenges socioeconomically, also in terms of educational levels, skills development, and I think it's recognized that economic development is very important, and I would emphasize that it is sustainable economic development, because the environment remains incredibly important in that region of Canada, and it is very important to the communities and residents that live there. But at the same time, having a population in our north means that we have to be able to, that they have to be able to have a resilient and a resilient life and a standard of living that compares to what we have here in the south. In this context, and this is interesting in the discussion that we're having today, having reached out to so many stakeholders and having done so many workshops and meetings, etc., we were very surprised that gender never came up. It just wasn't part of the conversation. The conversations was much more about other economic pressing issues, including social issues and welfare issues, but gender never played itself out. And then we had a bit of an aha moment towards the end of our consultation phase. I remember very clearly sitting in a room not dissimilar to this one in Whitehorse, and we did have quite a few Indigenous women representatives with us. And I think somebody posed the question, why does gender never come up? We're talking about everything. Everything is open, but gender doesn't come up. And a number of Indigenous women opened up and said, well, we really don't talk formally about these issues because the male leadership in our organization really doesn't appreciate that. And so we started to be able to unpacking some of the barriers to having the conversation. So going into specifically the more gender-related part of the presentation. I would say that in the North, gender plays itself out differently in terms of what we have learned over the last months than elsewhere. You probably know that from a foreign policy perspective, our minister has a very strong feminist foreign policy priority, and that plays itself out in investments in peace and security, more female peacekeepers, but also in areas like development aid, where there's much, much greater focus on women and children in particular. In the North, we see gender not just as a women issue in terms of the dynamics, but it's much more intersectoral, and that's why I put in this slide. From our point of view, from the work that we've done, and I should emphasize that we're not necessarily experts in this area, even though we have started to draw on our gender experts within the department that deal with these types of issues. Rather than looking at sort of equality between genders, we're really looking more at a gender-based analysis plus. And I just want to briefly mention what we mean by that. It's a matter of looking at socioeconomic issues and cultural issues as well from a fully inclusive point of view, where you consider gender as one of the elements to be considered, but in conjunction with other elements such as geographic location, but also race, disability, age, religion, ethnicity, etc. So it's a very holistic way of looking at what the situation is on the ground, and in terms of what kinds of policies and programming we want to develop to address them. So that's kind of where the government generally is at the moment. This is in no way unique to global affairs, but it seems to be an approach that fits, is very adaptable to the Northern context, because we see a number of dynamics that are different from, let's say, the South in Canada or other countries for that matter. So what are some of the things that we're seeing in terms of the gender point of view? We've identified 5 key areas, issue areas that affect both men and women. In terms of mental health, for instance, the statistics show that Indigenous men are actually disproportionately affected by mental wellness challenges. In other words, the rate of suicide in the North is higher among men than women. In terms of the other two, food insecurity and gender-based violence, that trends more on the female side. Based on statistics. However, I should throw in that the data and the statistics relating to our North are not great. I think this is an area that now, with new money being invested into statistical research and data, there's going to be more emphasis. If you're a researcher, and we'll hear that soon, dealing with Northern issues, it's sometimes really hard to find the sort of evidence base that is needed to develop policies and programs. In terms of education, it appears that Indigenous women and Northern women have a higher success rate in terms of attaining certain levels of education and diplomas. Indigenous men in particular are known to drop out early in terms of their schooling. Yet, when we look at skills development, it's still the men who often get the skilled trades jobs. So there's an interesting dynamic there. Moving on then to the next page, I just want to talk very briefly about some of the opportunities that we have. This new policy that I described earlier has already received a certain amount of investment from the government. In budget 2019, $700 million were made available for Northern work. That included, luckily, over $30 million for my division to do some work on the international level. And these are foundational investment. I think the approach by the current government is that that's sort of a down payment for investments down the road in Canada's north and internationally. But with what we gained already, and what we hope the policy will confirm, is that we have opportunities to look at gender gender gaps and gender interests in a number of areas, including through the enhancement of opportunities for trade and investment. That's an area that's generally underdeveloped to date, but that also has a very strong gender focus in the sense that one can target programming towards women-led enterprises, Indigenous-led enterprises, and so that gives us an opportunity to promote those areas. And also to connect northern businesses with business innovation programming that already exists at the federal level. And importantly, in this area, again, we need more data and knowledge. We're still very short in terms of really understanding the sectoral pieces and how the sectors, how they play themselves out in the north vis-a-vis the south. Polar science and Indigenous knowledge are a priority area for us, particularly moving forward, and that can also be driven by a gender lens moving forward. And this is also an area where either bilaterally with other countries or multilaterally in the Arctic Council, we just have a tremendous amount of opportunities. There's a huge appetite in many countries to work more on Arctic science and knowledge, and so we have a role to play. And then importantly, in terms of our climate change strategies, women are at the forefront of experiencing the effects of climate change. We had a recent report come out by Environment and Climate Change Canada, again emphasizing how the impacts of climate change play themselves out in such a more dramatic fashion in the north compared to elsewhere. And women being in the communities are very much at the forefront of experiencing that. As a result, they've also taken a real leadership role in terms of driving climate change science and climate change policies. To give you an example, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, a well-known Inuk woman, wrote a book about the right to be cold, and that is internationally recognized as a very important work that shows how community interests and community challenges play themselves out in climate change negotiations. Where we haven't done a good job, though, is we often haven't had Indigenous and female representation at the negotiations, at the international negotiations, and I think our environment minister has really tweaked to that and has established a number of fora, including a leader summit that's going to be held in Ottawa in May, to address that gap. And I know I'm probably running a little late, so I'm getting to my last point, and that's really the work of the Arctic Council. And I'll just make a couple of points about that. The Arctic Council has now existed for well over 20 years. It's the foremost multilateral forum where the 8 Arctic states come together to discuss their mutual interests, and it's a policy-making body, and they look at a very full spectrum of issues from socioeconomic development to assessing climate change impacts to understanding the mercury content in the Arctic, black carbon, you name it. Canada historically has very much emphasized the work of the Sustainable Development Working Group that focuses specifically on human issues. Some other countries, especially the Nordics, have a history of putting more of their emphasis on understanding better the environment in the Arctic. So this is an important thread for us, and we also support very much the work of the Indigenous permanent participants. There are 6 in total that are represented at the Arctic Council table, 3 of whom have roots in Canada. The Arctic Athabascan Council, the Gwich'in Council International, and then there is the Inuit Circumpolar Council as well that represents 4 countries, including Canada. We work very hard to support their capacity to have a voice in the council, and I think they are also very interested in specifically honing in on social issues, and that would include gender as well. So what has the council done to date in terms of gender? It started out in the early 2000s. I believe, I can't remember whether it was under the Icelandic chairmanship, but it was the first time the Arctic Council was starting to think about gender being an Arctic issue too. That it plays itself out in the Arctic as well. And so they issued a number of reports, they did some workshops and some studies, and those are publicly available on the Arctic Council website. But then, interestingly, from sort of a siloed approach to gender, they moved more into considering gender in certain projects of the Arctic Council across the technical working groups. So either working groups that are focused on the environment or on human issues or search and rescue, whatever it may be, to have a little bit more of a kind of general approach. And that has led them most recently at their last meeting to think about gender mainstreaming. And that's a different approach than sort of looking at gender equality or having specialized gender projects. That's really about developing a lens, a gender lens, into the work of the entire Arctic Council. And that's what we're doing at the federal government level as well. So taking that inclusive approach that I described earlier, this gender-based plus, as a way of analyzing policies, directions, strategies, investments to make sure that that angle is considered. It may not always be relevant, but at least considered. And this is kind of the space they're in now. There is a ministerial meeting coming up in May in Finland, where Finland will be handing over its presidency of the Council to Iceland. And Iceland is a very gender-focused country. They will definitely take that opportunity to move this gender mainstreaming into the forefront, at least to make more progress. So I think the next couple of years are going to be interesting to watch in the Arctic Council if you're interested in Arctic gender issues. And I know I've talked way too long, so apologies for that. I'll stop here. Thank you.
I'm a professor at INRS in Montreal, and most of my research for over the last 10 years, about 10 years, I've been, focusing on Inuit society, mostly in Nunavut. And most of my work has been looking at gender issues, more specifically in the economy. So my presentation today is entitled Exploring Gender in Inuit Society, Northern Economic Development. So I'll present on a project today that seeks to understand the various economic contributions made by Inuit women, with some data at the territorial level, some at the community level, but also at the family level. And I'll argue that Inuit women are an important bridge between market economy and subsistence and hunting economy. So I'll do a brief introduction on the context of my work in Nunavut, then I'll present the ongoing research on gender and economic development in the Canadian Arctic, and then some concluding thoughts. So I'm a cultural geographer by training, and through research collaboration, I study the impacts of development strategies and policies on individuals and communities. And I'm particularly interested in gendered space, Inuit and Indigenous women's relation to space, economy, and contemporary social cultural practice, both in urban but also in rural space. In examining Indigenous women's social roles and responsibilities, several authors have demonstrated the importance of considering the broader colonial context. And in the Canadian Arctic, social policies and the massive relocation of Inuit have had major impact on family dynamics and gendered responsibilities. So the family relocation policy aimed to reorganize Inuit life according to dominant patriarchal ideas about the family, about work, community, and social relations. For instance, Inuit girls and women were to be trained in domestic science and household economics to become housewife, and Inuit men were expected to engage in the labor force to fulfill their breadwinner roles. So colonial policies introduced cultural bias in the conception of gender division of labor, which resulted in undermining Inuit women's agency and social position. So racialized and gender colonial legacies have shaped gender power relations within Northern communities and contributed to Inuit women's marginalization from previously shared responsibilities. So to understand Inuit women's contemporary role and, broadly speaking, economic role, cultural, social role, we need to pay attention to the role that colonialism has played and continue to play in shaping social and spatial inequalities in Nunavut, but also across the Arctic. So now I'll jump in the research project that looks at Inuit women's economic contribution in Nunavut. So Canada Northern region has been the center of increased attention over the last decades, while economic development has been polarized recently around the issue of globalization and non-renewable resource development. Little to no attention has been paid to the role of Inuit women in contemporary development. This research specifically addresses these gaps by addressing several questions about the participation of Inuit women in a modern social economy in Nunavut. So the research speaks to major policy debates concerning Northern economic development, drawing from Northern economic literature on Native women and work, and also Inuit mixed economy. And I ask how this transforming economic environment promotes or limits women's participation in the Northern labor force, and what are the impacts of these economic transformation on Inuit society, communities, and families. To do so, I use 3 different geographical scales, so territorial, community, as well as individual scales. So I'll give you a little bit of background on Nunavut for those maybe who are not familiar. So the vast majority of the population identifies as Inuit, and it's among the fastest growing population in Canada. Its economy is dominated by 3 main sectors: construction, mining, and oil and gas extraction, and public administration. But one very interesting characteristic of Nunavut's economy are the gendered aspects. So in the public administration, 7 out of 10 employees are female. And also, if we look at the employment rates on the graph here, for Inuit women in red and men in black in Nunavut between 1994 and 2016, over the last 10 years, so since 2006, women's employment rate are higher than men. And in terms of earnings, in 2016, for the first time, Inuit women are earning more than men with a positive gender wage gap. So at the territorial level, the development of the wage economy seems to be favoring Inuit women with a constant increase in their labor force status and income. But what does it mean for communities as well as for individuals? So using these data, I turned to the community level, where I analyzed women's work and responsibility in the context of Inuit mixed economy. So in Kanjiktuguapik, I conducted a community-based study where data were collected between 2010 and 2013. We'll have another round of data collection in 2020 on an additional piece for this project. And so Kanjiktuguapik is a remote community on the shore of eastern Qikiqtaaluk Island. a population just over 1,000 people, and 29 women and their family participated in the project, so it represents about 15% of the population. So we used a mixed method approach, and I can talk more about that if you want after. So we used interviews, life history calendar, but also economic diaries to record the flow of money incomes within families. So at the community level, women in the community are actively engaged in the labor force, and they have very similar employment and unemployment rates than other communities in the territory, with the exception of Iqaluit, of course. They earn a large proportion of the total household income, and they make important economic decisions for their families and household. In Kanjik-Taguapik, women engage actively in domestic labor, being the primary caregiver for their household and extended families. And all women participants in our sample also engage in land-related work at various degrees. So harvesting activities range from occasional berry picking and fishing to regular extended travel on the land, hunting seal, caribou, polar bear, different species of birds, as well as country food preparation. At the community level, we found that women earn a large proportion of the total household income, and they are increasingly becoming the primary breadwinners in their household. They were also the one responsible for financial management for their family. And maybe more interestingly, from a cultural perspective, many women allocate part of their income to support harvesting activities. So through their wage, women provide monetary support and resource needed for their husbands, sons, brothers, fathers to harvest and provide country food resource for their family and extended family members. So on the figure here, it shows that 3 out of 4 women supported at least one harvester during the previous year, and different forms of support were described by women, ranging from occasional gifts to regular and substantial transfer of cash and expensive gifts. Some women, like Beatrice, who had a permanent and well-paid job at a school, were involved in multiple and regular transfer to support harvesting activities. And she said, "My husband is unemployed right now, but he hunts a lot. He hunts caribou, seal, everything. We usually always have country food in our house. Mostly every day we eat country food. The way we do it is that I pay all the bills, the rent, and for the food too. Every paycheck, I usually transfer $300 in my husband's account so he can buy his hunting gear." So in her economic diary, Beatrice reported important expense, buying gas, sometimes even 3 times a day, buying gas 3 times in the same day. And the reason to do so was to access local food, to maintain subsistence harvesting practice, and to support Inuit distinct cultural practice. So in other words, for many participants, wage employment increased women's ability to contribute to cultural practice. So although women are not necessarily harvesting themselves, they support subsistence practice, which in return reinforced Inuit values and identity. Now, these findings bring me to the individual level, where we investigate the effects of women's economic role on their social position, social status. So from an economic perspective, it appears that Inuit women are gaining more power by becoming the main breadwinner in many households. But from a cultural perspective, this division of labor suggests more mitigated response. So while we discussed power with research participants, we found complex and multi-layered definition and representation of power. Many female participants considered their wage employment and individual income as a way to gain independence as well as a form of power over their own lives. So providing for the family was a key theme when discussing power with women. Overall, most women agreed that employment provided women with personal freedom, autonomy, and a sense of self-worth and self-reliance. However, although employment is a way to improve women's status and control over resource, it can also have contradictory implications for women, such as increased work and obligation. And many participants felt obligated at some level to work because their family depended on their wage, to eat and to have a place to stay, and because just no one else was taking that responsibility. So the results show that although the development of a wage economy has favored women in terms of employment, it has not necessarily resulted in a similar shift in the distribution of power. And consequently, Inuit women appear to be disadvantaged at two levels. First, the work they do in the wage economy is often less valued than work in the subsistence economy. And second, the nature of their contribution is also undervalued. Money does not hold the same cultural value compared to country foods. So overall, the study makes important contribution to Northern economic research. Gender is shown to play a crucial role in explaining wage work dynamics in contemporary Nunavut and within Inuit families. Not only Inuit women are active in the labor force, they occupy new roles in the wage economy and subsistence sector. And because money is important to both sectors, I'd argue that they are actually positioned at the center of production and critical to connect both sectors of the economy. A second point this research makes is to recognize Inuit women's agency. In the Northern economic environment, women are not passive victims. They are empowered individuals with the ability to transform family and community socioeconomic well-being. And thirdly, by examining relations surrounding labor and economic development policy, this research contributes theoretical and substantive insight to this key side of colonial encounter. So women are also important actors in the development of northern regions. And overall, the project adds to growing interest and research focus on Indigenous women's well-being in Canada. And it makes an important point that gender is an important topic in Indigenous scholarship and policy. And the project highlights the need to better integrate gender aspects in decision-making, implementation, and monitoring of Indigenous public policy in Canada. And I'm currently pursuing research in that area where I further investigate questions of labor, identity, places, and inequalities as important sites of interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous societies. And these are important debates for community scholars, professionals, and decision makers. So thank you. I hope the presentation raised some questions.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Mathieu, for inviting me. It's been, it was so exciting to receive a message saying we're organizing something about gender in the Arctic, because you rarely hear that. So when you hear it, you jump on it. So I just came from Waterloo, where I'm doing my PhD. And Women of the Arctic is not related to my dissertation work or anything, but it's a labor of love of a lot of different women. And it's an organization based out of Finland, which I co-founded with 2 other women specifically. So we do kind of the day-to-day operations, but really it's much more than the 3 of us. So I'm here on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of Gosia Smieszek, who is based in Finland. She's also a researcher at the University of Lapland in the Finnish Environment Institute. And I'm here also on behalf of Lena Rantamalo, who is based in Norway, but who is an industrial designer who does a lot of really cool science exhibitions about the Arctic. Her last one was on a nuclear icebreaker in Russia. So the three of us, a lot of this stems from our frustrations of working in our individual fields and not necessarily seeing a lot of women and not having a lot of women to share our experiences with, our own experiences. So this all started with me busting into Gosha's office at one point during an event and saying, we're always talking about Arctic change, we're talking about Arctic governance, but where's gender, as you had mentioned? And so nobody's talking about the women, and yet a lot of women are integral to their communities. And you read a lot of reports, and it says that women are key to resilience, they're the knowledge holders, and yet you rarely, well, up until recently, see them on panels. They're still not on plenary panels most of the time, especially when they focus on Arctic shipping or on things relating to resource development or just governance in general. So we were lucky enough to receive funding from the Nordic Council, or I guess it's called Nordforsk, and a lot of this funding was given to us kind of with an earmark as to it going to gender-related stuff. So we said, okay, well, how about we do this event at the University of the Arctic Congress, which was happening in Helsinki and in Oulu in northern Finland last year, and let's do an event that's focused on women specifically, and let's make it open to the public, which was interesting because that's really hard to do at an academic conference where everybody's expected to pay a lot of money. So we chose a building that was required to be a public and open space by the university, and so we asked if we could host it there. So it was a nice, tricky way of getting around the fact that, you know, you would have to pay entry of 400 euros to go to this event. So we did that, and we had a lot of other stipulations when it came to how we wanted this event to go down. So we wanted it to be non-academic, which would mean that it would be structured slightly differently. It would mean that we would have activists, and we would have artists, and we would have policymakers, and we would have women with lived experience, so, as well as scientists, come together and talk about their experiences. And so we did that. We did that in September. And as I go through this, I'm kind of going to point to a lot of the things that have already been mentioned. But really, this is just a platform for me to share the work that other women are doing, because the three of us, we really just want to provide a platform. And that's what Women of the Arctic is, a platform for other women's work to be shared. So these are the women we gathered. We were only allowed to bring 60 women to this event, but because these events are few and far between, about 100 people signed up, including some men, which is really exciting, and they seem to enjoy it very much, as well as people of all genders. And so the first thing we did at this two-day event was to kick it off with the arts, which rarely happens at scientific events. And so what we did was we commissioned a play from a playwright, a Canadian playwright based in New York, who has an arts collective called the Arctic Cycle. And she's writing 8 plays about the 8 Arctic states, and she goes to each state, and she does a lot of field work, and then based on the stories that she's hearing, she writes a play. And she tries to communicate a lot of the changes that are happening in the Arctic in a way that would allow universities in different parts of the world to understand and to grasp the challenges that are being faced. So she happened to go to Alaska a couple of years ago, and I met her, and she said, yeah, there's a lot of these amazing women in Alaska doing amazing things, and I'm going to write a play about them. So we said, perfect. So we sent her a few more articles because we'd been working with some researchers who had been doing work on human trafficking in circumpolar Canada and circumpolar US. And we said, well, could you maybe also consider this and speak to some of these researchers and the work that they're doing, because this never gets talked about. And it would be amazing if we could have this pop up at the big gala event where all the policymakers are and where all the scientists are, and they're gonna have to start talking about this. And so she did that. And she had a woman, an actress, come with her, and this was all directed by another woman. And she walked up on stage in the middle of the event and started talking about a lot of the issues, but in a way that people could grasp, and in a way that wasn't necessarily too depressing. It was still empowering. And so here is one of the excerpts from the play. And so she had talked about the migration of whales, but also the migration of women in Alaska. both by their own volition, but also forced migration. And these are the three amazing women that came and that produced all of this. The second day was a full day of panels, 3 panels. The first one, here's one of our panels. The first one focused on Northern women at the table. The second one focused on women in Arctic science and exploration. And then the third one focused on grappling with uncomfortable conversations. And so that largely focused on gender-based violence and its impact on women and children, which is disproportionately the case, although it also happens to men as well. And we focused on 3 questions specifically. So we asked our participants and speakers who were from all Arctic states, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, as well as individuals, all women, who worked on Arctic-related issues but lived south of the Arctic, to engage with these 3 questions. What do women of the Arctic see as the most pressing issues to be addressed in their respective fields and communities? What do they see as the greatest challenges in addressing these issues? And which tools do women of the Arctic identify as necessary to solving these issues? Alternatively, which tools are already working? So our first panel included high-level policymakers. It included the State Secretary of Finland. It included its former Minister of Gender. It included a woman based out of Lofoten who runs her own business with other women doing research, particularly stuff relating to science policy. We also had a woman who is the speaker for the Sami parliament in Russia. And so what they shared was a lot of the systemic barriers that they face, no matter whether they are in Finland, where gender equality is considered to be quite on par, versus Russia, where it's not necessarily considered to be so. And the insights were quite telling in terms of it begins at a young age with how children are socialized. In the second panel, we had a lot of discussions about how science is conducted. And so we had the president of Yukon College speak to us. We had a woman who runs an international network, education network from Russia. We had a permafrost scientist, a PhD scholar. We also had an explorer, so a woman who runs something called Sedna Epic. She takes all-female crews and does exploration in the Canadian North, training particularly in Inuit girls to use robots and to use various types of STEM skills in the North, which aren't necessarily easily accessible at this time because we're still working towards a university in Canada's North. And then the third panel had artists. So we had someone who worked in theater who had worked with a woman who had been deported as a child from Greenland to Denmark. And they used art as a tool to help her heal through this experience. So they spoke about that. We had a lawyer who has done a lot of work on missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Alaska. We also had the director of the only women's shelter in Iceland speak about service provision for women and children. So it was very interdisciplinary, and we gained a lot of insights as to a lot of the intersections that you don't necessarily see at policy-oriented events as well as scientific events, and speaking about the day-to-day lives of people and really how it just comes down to interpersonal relationships at the end of the day. So here is the Finnish State Secretary and now the Secretary General of the Nordic Council of Ministers, Paula Lehtomäki, who opened our event with a lot of the Sami delegation of women from Russia, from Norway, and from Finland. And they were all really excited to be able to be in a room together because, this doesn't happen as often, and to be able to speak about their experiences as women and their perspectives. So this was followed by a breakout session we did at another big Arctic event, and some of you were there, which was really exciting, but it was called Towards an Arctic Women's Summit. And we kind of asked the audience, as well as our speakers, whether or not we should have an Arctic Women's Summit, and if so, what should it look like? And it was really, this is sad to say, but it was really exciting that a third of the audience were men. And they were incredibly excited and engaged at the fact of having an Arctic Women's Summit, but it also being about the role of men in these conversations. So So here's the panel that we had. So it included the head of the Gender Equality Center in Iceland. It included Sara Olsvik, who's a former minister in Greenland, and an Inuk woman who now works for UNICEF, who has been very outspoken about gender issues and children's issues. Also includes Nina Larsen, who runs a project called Denanaho in northern Canada. It also included Jane Francis, the head of the Antarctic Survey. And they all shared their experiences of working in their fields and what they think would be required at this type of event and whether or not we should even have it. The consensus was yes, we should have it, and there should be childcare. And a lot of men also concur. They said yes, there should be childcare. I would love to bring my daughter to these events because I hate leaving them behind. But there was also a big conversation about when should this event take place. And I think a lot of us who live in capital cities, who do a lot of policy work, don't necessarily think about timing of events and whether or not people can leave their homes and their communities and the true cost of doing that. And we were really grateful to a lot of these women for coming because they leave their communities so often and they're stretched so thin and they do not necessarily have the funding. And so that is kind of the biggest support that you can give, is actually taking these things into consideration, which we often do not. And also another conversation that came up was what should be the format of this type of event. Should it include men? Should it not include men? Should it include broader conversations about LGBTQ2S+ issues? Should it be a circle or should it be panel discussions or, what should it take? And there's no general consensus, but the general consensus is we should do it. So our plan is to do this next year, if all works well. And we were also really lucky at that time to meet an organization of women based in Iceland. And as we've heard, Iceland is doing quite well in terms of gender equality, but they do still have a long ways to go because it's not fully equal. And so these lovely women right here are the Icelandic Women's Association, and they've done a lot of the legwork behind this, which was the 1975 protest where 90% of the women walked out of their workplace and out of their homes to protest for equal pay, which is now a law in Iceland, and they were very successful. And this was the protest, the last protest. So women are still protesting. The last one, biggest one, was in 1975, so that's quite telling. But they shared a lot of stories and a lot of anecdotal evidence that you cannot find anywhere. It hasn't been written about, and we've asked them to write some of this down so that others can learn from a lot of the work that they've already done, because their work has been truly tremendous. And then the last event that we went to, the first one was a plenary panel on smart and resilient cities at Arctic Frontiers, which actually the government of Canada and GAC supported me to go to, which was very exciting because gender usually doesn't get talked about on these plenary sessions. And this was an opportunity to speak about it alongside other scholars who don't necessarily focus on gender, and to truly ask some big questions as to how women can be included and whether or not women should be the only ones to bear the burden of resilience within an Arctic context. And so here are some outtakes from that. And one of the big questions that was raised is, what can Canada learn from a lot of the Nordics who seem to have figured it out, which was a great question asked by Michael Byers, like a pretty well-known Arctic scholar. But it's not necessarily the right question to be asked. And so because we were only given 5 minutes, we decided to write an op-ed in response and say, look, the Nordics are doing way better than a lot of our other Arctic countries, but there's still a long ways to go. And it just so happens that there's so many issues, particularly gender-based violence, that are a prominent issue across the Arctic and need to be addressed and are just chronically remain unaddressed in a lot of Arctic contexts. So because we don't just want it to be these random conference events where we speak up and then we leave and do our own little research, we also wanted to maintain a long-term focus, and we wanted this to be accessible for people who can't afford to come to these events or for people who don't have the time. And so we were trying to figure out, how do you do this? You know, we're scholars, and most of the time we just spend our time behind our computers writing. And so it took a lot of time for us to figure out how to best do this with the funding that we had. And so one thing that we did was to create an online platform, a digital storytelling platform called Plan A, where gender is not Plan B in the Arctic. And one of the things we did was we collected photos of women from across the Arctic. And please, everybody here, you know, if you work on the Arctic, if you live in the Arctic, send us your photo to provide a full picture of what it means to be a woman of the Arctic, because I think most people have an idea of what it is, but this is it. And a lot of people email us saying, hey, I don't see a Sami woman on there, but it shows our own prejudices because there are Sami women in these photos. And so it's been a fascinating discourse. And we also worked with a communications crew called What Took You So Long, who came to our event in Helsinki and did a series of interviews with some of our speakers and our participants. And those videos came out earlier this year once they edited them. And so they took these long-form interviews that they had done that took hours, and they turned them into snippets of 2 to 3 minute interviews that you can watch on our website now. And it was truly amazing to see these bite-sized conversations about different issues. And so here we have one of the people we interviewed is the former president of Finland, Tarja Halonen. Here's another person, Valentina Sofkina. She's the speaker of the Sami parliament in the Kola Peninsula in Russia. Michelle Demert, who is a law and policy consultant to the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, as well as the Chief Justice of the Hayadat Tlingit Alaska Tribe. Karen Barnes, the president of Yukon College. Caroline Landau, who is an artist who archives ice using glass blowing. Sigþrúður Gudmundsdóttir, who is the head of the One Women's Shelter in Iceland. And this is Kirsty Bush. She runs an all-female team of women with PhDs based out of Lofoten who do primarily marine-based research. And they could have not gotten these jobs where they live now unless they had started their own jobs, which is really, really neat to follow. And so, how much time do we have? I wanted to show, here are some of the issues that were discussed. So some of it was gender-related, of course, because women seem to be most of the time the experts on gender, but it was also quite broad. With women discussing things such as the role of government, Arctic governance, the future of the Arctic, alcoholism and oppression, and you can watch all of these and hear them for yourself. And then another thing that we've done, I'm going to skip because we don't have much time. Another thing that we've done is we've partnered with Erica Dingman, who runs a pretty prominent Arctic blog on Arctic-related issues internationally. And she's been interviewing women about the issues in their communities that they think are important. And so here's Sarah Olsvik. That was one of the first people we interviewed. And then we also interviewed Madeline Redfern. And so they come out once a month going forward. So once again, providing an ongoing platform for women to speak about their issues. And if it's okay, can I show one thing? I think I have to click on it. I just want to show you, we created a trailer of the event in Helsinki.
The trailer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, never mind. You can watch it on our website, but I'll show you something else instead. Here's one of the interview videos that we did. Just so you can get a sense. Also doesn't work. Never mind. You can find it on our website. Oh, wait. Here is, technology is not.
My father was an Indigenous. He grew up in a very small village in Alaska. His first language was Tlingit, and he went and ended up with a master's degree. I just, I find him to be my inspiration for a lot of things, but all the things that he overcame as a result of being born in the 20s and all the racism that he experienced, but he never let that really get him down. He was one of the most optimistic people that I've ever met, and in that he always told me I could do whatever I wanted, but there was a time there that I didn't believe that was possible, but now I believe that is possible.
So you can find 100+ of those videos on the website and watch them. They're on all kinds of different things. But yeah, the plan is to keep working on this and to provide a platform for women, such as these lovely women, to speak about the amazing work that they're doing and to have the world see it. So yeah, you can find us at genderisnotplanb.com. Yeah.
Well, Q&A time, so if you have questions, if you have questions, then just raise your hand. I can give you the mic, and it's all part of the video caption, so yes.
Sometimes at these meetings, acknowledgement is made that the land in Ottawa-Gatineau is unceded Algonquin territory. I didn't hear anybody say that. I mean,
Yes, we forgot. Yes. But yes, it is. Unceded Algonquin territory. Questions or for our panelists? Yes.
I have a question about the sort of forthcoming programs. I know in northern Scandinavia, some of the post-secondary education is focused on Indigenous cultural-based education. And I know you mentioned development in STEM education, and I'm wondering if there are any initiatives like that in Canada that focus not so much on industrialization of the North, but on recognizing Indigenous food production and all of those things as important to maintaining and developing future education programs in, especially as it relates directly to women and so much.
Do you want to jump in? I can start off. A couple of things. There is a network of educational institutions, the Arctic colleges, that are very much community-based and hone in on that type of teaching, bringing in Indigenous knowledge and elders as well. There's been a major development with the Yukon College becoming the university, Yukon University, just about now actually. And that's an interesting educational institution in that it has a full university program, but as well it has other programs that focus in on sort of northern innovation as it pertains specifically to that region. So I think depending on where you look, you will find different models, but I'm not that familiar with the domestic setup because I'm more working internationally. So I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think the Arctic College, as you mentioned, they have specific programs in every community. Some of them are at least try to integrate as much as possible of Indigenous knowledge and ways of doing. But it really depends it really depends of the program, but also just the school system has been transforming over the last 20 years and trying to integrate much more Inuit social values into the primary and secondary high schools, programs.
Just to add, I think the Labrador Institute has also been doing quite excellent work, which is, based in Labrador, working with communities, a lot of them which are fly-in communities. So I think that would be one model to look at.
Any other question for our panelists?
Thank you so much. Actually, I don't have a question, only a comment. And actually, this goes to Tahne. You were wondering whether you should include men to your activities, and I have done earlier a lot of development cooperation, and my experience and understanding is also that you can sometimes get very quick results if you include men and you try to change them their attitude towards all kind of bad habits which are against women. So I would encourage you to include men. Maybe one point also, we had on Sunday parliamentary elections in Finland, and 92% of the all new parliamentarians are women at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes, which is great news. By the way, not so great that the Finnish women's hockey team lost. But yes, I think we've had men approach us with two comments. So one has been, well, actually 3 different types of comments. One has been, yes, we want to be in the room. Yes, this is a broader societal conversation that needs to happen. Another one being, well, this is a women's thing. Well, why should I care? And then a third one being, and this is actually one of the more interesting ones, is we had the mayor of Nome in Alaska stand up at one of our events and say, you know, the things that you're talking about, I, as a gay man, experience in my community, and I'm the mayor of my community, and it's really taken a lot of work to try and deal with this on a community level, on a small northern community level. So yeah, I think it depends. It's not just men as one giant category, of course, right? There's a lot of diversity in that question as well.
Other. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I would like to ask and know how are women being included in the responses to climate change events in the Arctic, and how the policy of Canada is currently addressing that issue. Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you raise, and it's something that certainly at the federal government level, a lot of thinking has gone into, especially under the current government. We've reinvigorated our engagement in climate change negotiations, and I think there is a recognition that diverse views need to inform Canada's positions on climate change. And in that regard, Minister McKenna, for instance, has a lot of working groups that bring information to her, and that includes specifically women as well. And to go one point further, more in the northern and Arctic context, Indigenous representatives have always have for a long time had a role in informing Canada's position, but that relationship is more intensified now that ministers and senior officials actually take Indigenous representatives, both men and women, onto their delegations. And that's part of the commitment to reconciliation and the commitment to self-determination as well that we've made under the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights. So it's, I think, gradually there's been a closer and closer working relationship between the government and the stakeholders that have very significant interests in what's happening on climate change.
Hi. I'm just curious to see when these changes are being done, and I'm assuming they're being done with the women of the North, there's going to be backlash. I mean, you're looking at changing culture, there's going to be resistance. I'm hearing there's one center for women that is in place currently. So what kind of support, often one of the backlashes is increased domestic violence, for instance. What kind of support or what kind of conversation is happening around that to make sure and ensure the safety of the people that are involved in those changes?
One thing that a lot of women have mentioned, women have worked with in different communities, is the transition to women being more involved, for instance, in the economy has had some negative impacts. But many women have also argued that these were roles that they would be sharing previously on an equal basis, and that in some ways this is just going back to normal. And so they didn't see it as gaining something over men, but regaining what they previously had. So, exactly, yeah. So I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't raise any issues. I agree with you, but I think we have to be careful saying, like, assuming that the situation is the same then for us. And I think this is one thing that I've learned working with women, is that there is this feeling of gaining back what they had previously. Yeah.
So I'm going to speak about it more from a high level, international. My sense, I mean, Iceland doesn't have an Indigenous population, and so this isn't Indigenous specific. I think this is specific to gender-related issues, especially domestic violence and gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. I mean, a lot of these establishments are underfunded, they're under-researched, there's very poor data out there. So it's really difficult to make decisions on these things, especially from capital cities. And yeah, I'm not sure we would be adequately prepared for a massive backlash, but I don't see that also happening as a result of a policy change, but I might be completely wrong on this, so.
Other questions? I mean, we have time maybe for 2 or 3 more questions. I have one anyway, if nobody has. For Magali, looking at the data you presented, what type of, I'm unfamiliar a bit with Clyde River and that part of, what type of economic development is going on around there? My question is mostly about, do we see kind of a different picture when there's the extractive industry, when there's mining projects? Do we see a different distribution, let's say, of employment or, yeah?
That's actually a very good question. That's actually why we're doing a second round of data collection in Kanjiktukwapik, because in 2010, 2013, there was no mine near the community, but the Mary River mine opened recently, and so there's a lot of fly-out workers from the community now, and so we would like to document how that had impact employment in the community. And so we're looking at different ways of, way to consider work. So we're looking at people that work at the mine, work in the public administration and so on, but we're also looking at other economic activities such as hunting and harvesting also. So we're looking at the broader picture of work in the community, yeah.
Any other question? We have time maybe for 2 more questions if people want to ask a specific question to one of our panelists.
Maybe I can give a little invitation to, if you're interested in gender and development, because I see some people from Paututi here at the Inuit Women's Association of Canada, and we are co-organizing a panel on gender and development at Inuit Studies that will be held in October, next October in Montreal. So if you're interested on the topic, I'm inviting you to look at this event online.
Right, so if you have a question, I would like to thank our panelists. We still have time if you want to talk with them, after we're done. So I'd like to thank again our panelists for sharing our expertise and their experience with us. Thank you.